the sacred drums echo through the stone temples of Tenochtitlan. A priest emerges from the shadows, his body draped in what looks like loose, yellowing fabric. But as he steps into the torchlight, you realize it's not fabric at all. It's human skin. And according to some of history's most disturbing accounts, these weren't just any skins. They were the flayed remains of children, worn for 20 straight days in one of humanity's most shocking religious rituals. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. For over 500 years, we've been telling this story wrong. What I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about the Aztecs' most feared deity and the priests who literally wore death as their sacred garment. And trust me, the truth is somehow even more disturbing than the myth. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover exactly what happened during those 20 days of horror, why mothers actually brought their own children to touch these rotting skins, and the shocking archaeological discovery from 2019 that finally proved these rituals weren't Spanish propaganda, they were real. But most importantly, you'll learn why the story about children's skin might be the biggest historical lie ever told about the Aztecs. Before we dive into this nightmare, if you're fascinated by the dark truths of history that others are too afraid to discuss, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you've been taught about ancient civilizations. Picture this. It's March in the year 1519. The Spanish haven't conquered Mexico yet. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the greatest city in the Americas, something unthinkable is about to happen. The second month of the Aztec calendar has begun, Tlacaxipehualiztli, which literally translates to the flaying of men. For the next 20 days, the entire city will transform into a theatre of sacred horror. The preparations actually began 40 days earlier. War captives, and we'll get to exactly who these captives were in a moment, were selected from the wooden cages where they'd been held since their capture. These weren't random selections. The priests chose specific individuals who would serve as Ixiptla, living images of the god Xipe Totec, whose name alone should send chills down your spine. It means, our Lord the Flayed One. These captives weren't immediately killed. For 40 days they were bathed, purified, dressed in elaborate costumes and treated almost like royalty. They were given the finest foods, adorned with gold and feathers, and paraded through the city. The psychological torture of this must have been unbearable, knowing that your elevated status was only preparing you for the most horrific death imaginable. Now here's where the story takes its first dark turn. On the first day of Tlacaxipehualiztli, these captives were brought to the centre of the city, to a massive circular stone platform called the Temelacatl. What happened next was recorded by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Spanish friar who interviewed Aztec elders who had actually witnessed these events, and his account will haunt you. The captive was tied to the stone platform with a rope just long enough to allow movement. He was given weapons, but here's the sick twist. They were fake weapons. Instead of obsidian-edged swords that could slice through bone, he received wooden clubs decorated with feathers. His opponents, 4 of the Empire's most elite warriors, eagle and jaguar knights in full battle gear with real weapons. The crowd would gather in the thousands. This wasn't some hidden ritual in a dark temple. This was public spectacle on a scale that would rival any Roman Colosseum. The captive would fight with everything he had, knowing that defeat meant something far worse than death. Some fought so bravely that the crowd would cheer for them, even knowing their fate was sealed. One account tells of a captive warrior who managed to wound 2 eagle knights before being overwhelmed. The Aztecs honoured his courage even as they prepared him for what came next. When the captive finally fell, and they always fell, the real horror began. But wait, before I tell you what happened next, notice something crucial here. Every single historical account, every codex, every Spanish chronicle describes these gladiator victims as warriors, adult men captured in battle, not children. This detail becomes incredibly important for what I'm about to reveal. The fallen warrior was immediately dragged up the temple steps. At the top, on a sacrificial stone that archaeologists have actually found and you can see today in Mexico City, the victim was stretched out on his back. 4 priests held his limbs, while a 5th, the head priest, raised an obsidian knife. With practiced precision, he would slice beneath the ribcage and reach into the chest cavity. The still beating heart was ripped out and held high for the sun god to see. But death was only the beginning of this victim's journey. This is where even hardened Spanish conquistadors, men who had seen countless battles wrote that they became physically ill. The body was turned over to specialists, and yes, they had specialists for this. These men were called Tlacaxipehualiztli, literally the flayers. Their job was to remove the entire skin of the victim in one piece, like peeling off a wetsuit. The process was methodical and precise. Starting at the back of the head, they would make careful incisions down the spine, along the arms and down the legs. Using obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical steel, they would separate the skin from the muscle beneath. The goal was to keep the skin completely intact. Face, hands, feet, everything. Spanish witnesses reported that these specialists were so skilled they could complete the process in less than 20 minutes. One account from the Codex Magliabechiano, and you can actually see this image today, shows the moment of the flaying in graphic detail. The illustration doesn't hide anything. You can see the priest cutting, the skin being pulled away, the raw red flesh beneath. But again, look closely at these codex images. The victims are always shown as adult males, warriors, not children. Once removed, the skin was immediately given to a priest or a young warrior who would perform the most disturbing part of the entire ritual. They would put it on. Let that sink in for a moment. They would literally dress themselves in the still warm skin of another human being. The hands of the dead would dangle from their wrists. The face would hang over their own like the world's most horrific mask. Diego Duran, another Spanish chronicler, described seeing this. He was dressed in the skin of a sacrificed man, and on his wrists hung the hands of that skin. The skin of the face covered his own face like a mask with the lips and eye holes hanging loose. Try to imagine the weight of it, the warmth slowly fading, the blood still dripping. But here's where the endurance test truly began. These skin wearers, called Xipe, didn't just put on the skins for a ceremony and take them off. They wore them continuously for 20 days. 20 days. Think about what happens to flesh in heat and humidity. Think about what happens when you can't wash, when you're sweating beneath someone else's skin, when that skin begins to rot against your own body. The Xipe weren't allowed to bathe. They slept in the skins, ate in them, performed religious ceremonies in them. By day 3, the skin would begin to change colour, turning from pink to yellow to grey. By day 5, the smell would be noticeable from several feet away. By day 10, Spanish accounts say the stench was so overwhelming that people would vomit just from being near them. But here's what's truly insane. They didn't hide away in shame. These skin wearers paraded through the streets of Tenochtitlan every single day. They went door to door, entering people's homes, demanding offerings for the love of Xipe Totec. Imagine hearing that knock on your door, opening it to find a priest wearing rotting human flesh, the face hanging loose, maggots potentially beginning their work. The households had no choice but to welcome them. They would seat the Xipe on special beds made of leaves, give them the best food in the house, offer them pulque, the alcoholic drink made from agave. Some accounts say that people would even pay them just to leave quickly. The entire city lived in a state of religious terror for those 20 days. But wait, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that historians have been arguing about for decades. Remember how I mentioned mothers bringing their children to these skin-wearing priests? This is where the myth about children's skin might have started, and the truth is somehow even more disturbing than the fiction. The flayed skins were believed to have magical healing properties. Mothers with sick children would actually seek out these walking horrors. They would bring babies with eye infections, children with skin diseases, anyone suffering from illness, and have them touch the rotting flesh. The Aztecs believed that Xipe Totec, through his flayed representatives, could absorb disease and grant healing. Imagine being a mother so desperate to save your sick child that you would carry them through the streets, searching for a priest wearing decomposing human skin. Imagine holding your baby up to touch that flesh, praying to a god whose very appearance was nightmare made real. Spanish friars recorded seeing this happen repeatedly throughout the 20 days. One mother's account, preserved in Sahagun's writings, described how she brought her son who had been blind in one eye since birth. After touching the skin of the Xipe, she claimed his sight was restored. Whether through placebo effect, coincidence, or something else, enough people believed in these cures that the practice continued year after year for centuries. The skin wearers also engaged in mock battles throughout the city. Groups of them would fight against young warriors in training, but these weren't serious combats. They were ritual performances, almost like deadly theatre. The Xipe would chase people through the streets, rattling ceremonial staffs called Tlacaxipehualiztli, their rotting skin suits flapping as they ran. Children would flee in terror while adults watched from doorways, caught between religious obligation and primal revulsion. Now here's a detail that will absolutely blow your mind. In 2019, archaeologists in Puebla, Mexico made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about these rituals. They found the first confirmed temple dedicated to Xipe Totec. Not drawings of a temple, not Spanish descriptions, the actual temple where these rituals took place. What they found was beyond disturbing. Stone sculptures of Xipe Totec wearing carved human skins, complete with extra hands dangling from the wrists. Circular altars with channels carved for blood drainage. But most disturbing of all, they found what they believe are the pits where the flayed skins were deposited after the 20 days were over. The lead archaeologist, Noemi Castillo, described finding these holes in the temple floor, still containing traces of organic matter that suggested they were used for storing the skins. After 20 days of decay, when the skins were quite literally falling apart, they would be carefully removed and placed in these sacred pits. Some accounts say they were stored in special ceramic jars with tight-fitting lids. Apparently even the Aztecs couldn't stand the smell by that point. But here's the smoking gun that destroys the myth about children's skins. Nowhere in this temple, nowhere in any archaeological site related to Xipe Totec, have researchers found evidence of child victims being flayed. The bone evidence, when found, consistently shows adult males. The temple iconography depicts adult-sized skins. The storage pits are sized for adult human remains. So where did this story about children's skins come from? After diving deep into the historical records, I found the answer, and it's a perfect example of how historical telephone can turn disturbing truth into outright horror fiction. In several Spanish accounts, there are mentions of women and children being sacrificed during Tlacaxipehualiztli. But here's the crucial detail everyone misses. They weren't flayed. The Aztecs had a religious obligation to sacrifice every single war captive during this festival. If they had captured enemy women or children during raids, yes, they would be killed along with the warriors, but their skins weren't worn by the priests. The confusion seems to come from one line in the Florentine Codex where it states, "All the captives died. All who were made captive. The men, the women, all the children." Later historians, either through translation errors or sensationalism, conflated this with the flaying ritual. They read about children being sacrificed during the festival, and priests wearing skins during the festival, and somehow combined them into priests wearing children's skins. There's also another factor. The Spanish had every reason to exaggerate the horror of Aztec rituals. It justified their conquest, their destruction of indigenous culture, their forced conversions to Christianity. What better propaganda than to claim these savages wore the skins of innocent children? The truth that they wore the skins of enemy warriors was horrible enough, but apparently not horrible enough for some chroniclers. But don't think for a second that this makes the reality any less disturbing. Let me paint you a picture of day 15 of the festival, based on multiple eyewitness accounts. By this point, the skins have been rotting in the Mexican heat for over 2 weeks. They've turned black in places, green in others. The flesh is literally falling off in chunks. Flies swarm around the Xipe constantly. The smell, described as a mixture of rotting meat and human waste, can be detected from hundreds of feet away. Yet the priests continue their duties. They still perform ceremonies at the temple. They still visit households. They still dance in the public squares. One Spanish observer wrote that he saw a piece of skin fall off a priest's arm during a ceremony, landing on the ground with a wet slap. The priest simply continued his ritual as if nothing had happened. The psychological impact on the city must have been extraordinary. For 20 days, death walked among them. Not symbolic death, not metaphorical death, but actual rotting human remains animated by living priests. Children growing up in Tenochtitlan would have seen this every year of their lives. It was as normal to them as Christmas is to us, except instead of Santa Claus, they had priests wearing decomposing human flesh. By day 18 or 19, some accounts say the skins were so degraded that they would tear if the wearer moved too quickly. The priests had to walk slowly, carefully, to keep their sacred garments intact. The hands that dangled from their wrists would be black and shriveled. The face masks would barely hold together, held in place more by dried blood than by skin. On the 20th day, finally, mercifully, the ordeal ended, but not with a whimper, with one final ceremony. All the Sipim would gather at the temple of Xipe Totec. In front of the assembled population, they would carefully remove the skins. This wasn't a simple disrobing. After 20 days, the rotting flesh would have partially adhered to their own skin. The removal was likely agonizing. Once removed, the skins were treated with surprising reverence. They weren't simply thrown away, they were carefully folded. Imagine trying to fold 20-day-old human skin, and placed in the sacred containers I mentioned earlier. These containers were then sealed and stored in special chambers beneath the temple. The skins had served their purpose, allowing the priest to literally wear death and rebirth, to become the flayed god himself. The priests who had worn the skins then underwent an extensive cleansing ritual. They would bathe repeatedly, scrubbing their skin raw to remove any traces of the decay. They would fast for several days, drinking only sacred water infused with herbs. Some accounts suggest that many suffered from skin infections and diseases from their 20-day ordeal, though this was seen as a badge of honour rather than a medical emergency. Now you might be wondering, why? Why would any civilization, no matter how different their beliefs, subject themselves to this? The answer reveals something profound about how the Aztecs viewed the universe itself. To the Aztecs, Xipe Totec represented the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. His name, our Lord the Flayed One, came from their creation myth. According to their beliefs, Xipe Totec had flayed himself, removed his own skin to provide food for humanity. The golden corn that sustained their empire was seen as growing from his sacrifice. Think about a kernel of corn. It has an outer husk that must rot away in the earth before the new plant can grow. To the Aztecs, the priest wearing the rotting skin was a living metaphor for this process. The skin represented the old, dead matter that must decay for new life to emerge. When the priest finally removed the skin after 20 days, it symbolized the moment when the corn plant breaks through the earth. This wasn't meaningless brutality. This was their way of ensuring the universe kept functioning. Without this ritual, they believed the crops would fail, the sun wouldn't rise, the world would end. The priests who endured those 20 days of walking in death weren't just performing a ceremony. They were literally keeping reality intact through their suffering. But here's something that will really mess with your head. Remember those mothers bringing their sick children to touch the rotting skins? That wasn't desperation overcoming disgust. In the Aztec worldview, those decomposing skins were at their most powerful precisely because they were rotting. The decay represented transformation, the boundary between death and life where miracles could happen. Modern historians have found evidence that this ritual might have actually had some basis in primitive immunology. Exposure to certain bacteria in controlled doses can boost immune response. It's possible, and I stress possible, that some children who touched the skins and survived did develop stronger immune systems. Of course, many others probably died from infections, but those deaths wouldn't have been recorded as failures of the ritual. The skin-wearing priests occupied a unique position in Aztec society during those 20 days. They were simultaneously sacred and profane, honoured and avoided, powerful and polluted. People would bow to them in the streets while trying not to breathe. They would offer them the best food while hoping they would eat quickly and leave. They were living contradictions, embodying the Aztec understanding that creation and destruction were two sides of the same cosmic coin. One of the most fascinating accounts comes from a Spanish priest who witnessed the festival in 1524, just 3 years after the conquest. He described seeing an elderly Aztec priest who claimed to have worn the skins 15 times in his life. Do the math, that's 300 days of wearing rotting human flesh. When asked how he endured it, the old priest reportedly said, "You Christians wear your God on a cross. We wear our God as a skin. Both require suffering." That comparison might seem blasphemous, but it reveals something crucial about how the Aztecs viewed these rituals. To them, the suffering wasn't pointless sadism, it was a form of worship as profound as any Christian martyrdom. The priest wearing the rotting skin wasn't just dressed up for shock value, he was undergoing a spiritual transformation as radical as death and resurrection. The festival also served political purposes that historians are only now beginning to understand. The gladiator sacrifices at the beginning weren't random. Often, the victims were enemy nobles or renowned warriors captured in recent battles. By publicly defeating and flaying these enemies, the Aztecs were sending a message to rival cities. This is what happens to those who oppose us. but it went deeper than simple intimidation. By wearing the skin of a defeated enemy, the priest was symbolically absorbing that enemy's power into Tenochtitlan itself. The strength of their foes became the strength of their god, which became the strength of their empire. It was psychological warfare elevated to cosmic significance. The economic impact of the festival was also enormous. For 20 days, normal life in the city was disrupted. Markets operated differently, with special areas set aside for the Xipim to collect offerings. Craft workers produced special items, ceramic containers for the skins, new obsidian knives for the flaying, elaborate costumes for the initial ceremonies. The entire city's economy pivoted around this annual celebration of death and renewal. Now here's a detail that nobody talks about but is confirmed in multiple sources. Not everyone who wore the skins was a priest. Young warriors could volunteer for the honour, usually as payment for a vow. If Xipe Totec had granted them victory in battle or cured a family member's illness, they might promise to wear the skin during the next festival. Imagine being a teenager, knowing that next year you'll have to endure 20 days of wearing a corpse. These volunteers were prepared months in advance. They underwent purification rituals, fasting and psychological preparation. Senior priests would counsel them on how to endure the ordeal. They were taught special prayers to recite when the smell became overwhelming, meditation techniques to dissociate from the physical horror. It was essentially a form of extreme religious training that makes any modern military boot camp look like summer camp. The selection of who would provide the skins was equally ritualized. Not just any captive could be flayed for Xipe Totec. They had to be warriors who had shown bravery in battle or during their captivity. They had to be physically whole, no missing limbs or major scars that would mar the skin. They had to be of appropriate age, typically between 20 and 40 years old. Children simply didn't meet these criteria, which is another nail in the coffin of the children's skin myth. But here's where it gets even more intense. The warriors who captured these enemies in battle had a special relationship with the ritual. They were considered the fathers of the captives and were required to be present at the flaying. They couldn't participate directly. That would be like killing their own son, but they had to watch. After the skin was removed, they were given the body to take home, where it would be ritually consumed in a sacred meal. Yes, you heard that right. The flesh that was removed with the skin wasn't wasted. It was carefully prepared into a stew called Tlacaxipehualiztli, mixed with corn and chili peppers. The warrior who captured the victim would invite his family and closest allies to share this meal. They believed they were literally incorporating the strength and courage of their enemy into their own bodies. Now, before you judge this as simple barbarism, consider this. The Aztecs were horrified by European practices they considered cannibalistic. When they learned that Christians believed they were eating the actual body and blood of their god during communion, many Aztecs were disgusted. To them, eating an enemy warrior with full ritual acknowledgement was more honest than pretending bread was flesh. The children's role in all of this, when accurately understood, was actually quite specific. Besides those brought for healing, children of the nobility were required to witness the gladiator sacrifices. This was part of their education, teaching them about courage, death, and the obligations of the warrior class. They would watch from special platforms, close enough to see every detail but protected from the spraying blood. Some of these children, particularly boys destined for the warrior class, would be given small roles in the ceremony. They might carry ritual items, help prepare the sacred spaces, or assist in the cleaning afterwards. But they were never victims of the flaying itself. The archaeological record is clear on this. The bones found in ritual contexts associated with Xipe Totec are overwhelmingly adult males. As the Spanish conquest progressed and Christianity was forced upon the indigenous population, the festival of Tlacaxipehualiztli became a major point of conflict. Spanish priests were particularly horrified by the skin-wearing aspect, seeing it as the ultimate blasphemy against the human form made in God's image. They banned the practice immediately, making it punishable by death. But here's something fascinating. The ritual didn't disappear overnight. Historical records from the 1530s and 1540s, more than a decade after the conquest, report secret gatherings where modified versions of the ceremony were performed. Instead of human skins, some groups used animal hides. Others created elaborate costumes that mimicked the appearance of flayed skin without the actual flesh. In remote areas of Mexico, anthropologists in the early 20th century found remnants of Xipe Totec worship that had survived 400 years underground. Villagers would perform dances where participants wore yellowed leather garments designed to look like human skin. The memory of the ritual had outlasted the empire that created it. The psychological impact of these ceremonies on Aztec society can't be overstated. Every single person in Tenochtitlan would have seen the Xipe multiple times throughout their lives. The smell of decaying flesh would have been a regular part of their sensory experience. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It walked the streets, knocked on doors, demanded recognition. This constant exposure to mortality shaped their entire worldview. The Aztecs didn't fear death the way modern Western cultures do. How could they, when they saw priests literally wearing death as clothing? Death was just another state of being, a transition rather than an ending. The boundary between life and death was permeable, crossable, wearable. But let's address the elephant in the room, the sheer horror of it all. Even understanding the religious significance, even respecting cultural differences, the image of priests wearing rotting human skin for 20 days is nightmarish. And it was meant to be. The Aztecs weren't trying to make death comfortable or sanitized. They were confronting the raw reality of mortality head-on. The power of Xipe Totec came precisely from this horror. He was the god who wore death, who transformed the most terrifying aspect of existence into a source of renewal. In wearing the skins, the priests weren't just honouring him, they were becoming him, experiencing his mythical self flaying in the most literal way possible. Modern psychologists studying extreme religious practices have found parallels between the Xipe and other intense spiritual ordeals. The combination of physical discomfort, social isolation, and sensory assault from the rotting flesh would have induced altered states of consciousness. Many skin wearers probably experienced visions, hallucinations, and profound spiritual insights during their 20-day ordeal. These visions were taken seriously as messages from Xipe Totec himself. Priests would interpret their experiences during the skin-wearing period, using them to make predictions about the coming harvest, the outcome of future battles, or the health of the empire. The worse the physical ordeal, the more powerful the visions were believed to be. Now here's something that will absolutely shock you about the end of the 20 days. When the skins were finally removed and stored, the priests who had worn them were treated as heroes returning from war. They were given new names, honoured with feasts, granted special privileges. Young warriors who had volunteered to wear skins could use the experience to advance their military careers. It was like age-huge extreme qualification that proved their dedication beyond any doubt. But not everyone survived the ordeal. Some accounts mention priests who died during the 20 days, presumably from infections or disease contracted from the rotting flesh. These deaths weren't seen as failures. They were interpreted as Xipe Totec calling his most devoted servants to join him permanently. Their bodies would be given elaborate funerals, and their names would be remembered in temple records. The question remains, why 20 days specifically? The number wasn't arbitrary. 20 was sacred in Mesoamerican culture, representing a complete cycle. The Aztec month had 20 days. Their number system was based on 20s, and they believed the human body had 20 digits, fingers and toes, for a reason. By wearing the skin for exactly 20 days, the priests were completing a perfect cycle of death and rebirth. Archaeological evidence has also revealed that the number 20 appears repeatedly in Xipe Totec's iconography. Temple steps often came in sets of 20. Ritual objects were arranged in groups of 20. The obsidian knives used for flaying were stored in boxes of 20. This numerical obsession reinforces that the 20-day duration wasn't just practical, it was cosmologically essential. As we near the end of this journey through one of history's most extreme religious practices, I need to address why this matters today. Not because we should judge or condemn the Aztecs. They lived in a completely different world with completely different beliefs. But because understanding the extremes of human religious experience helps us understand the power of belief itself. The priests who wore those skins for 20 days weren't insane. They weren't sadists. They were people so committed to their understanding of how the universe worked that they would endure unimaginable horror to keep it functioning. That level of dedication, even in service of beliefs we find repugnant, reveals something profound about human nature. And yes, the myth about children's skins needs to die. It's a perfect example of how history gets distorted through repetition, how the truth is often horrible enough without embellishment. The reality, adult warriors being flayed and their skins worn for 20 days, is already so far beyond normal human experience that adding fictional elements only diminishes the genuine historical impact. So the next time you hear someone claim that Aztec priests wore children's skins, you can correct them, not to defend the Aztecs or minimize the horror of their practices, but to respect historical truth. The real story of Xipe Totec and his terrifying festival is dark enough without myths and exaggerations. The Spanish conquest ended the festival of Tlacaxipehualiztli, but it couldn't erase its memory. In Mexican museums today, you can see the stone faces of Xipe Totec still wearing their carved skins. In codices preserved in European libraries, the images of the Xipem still walk their eternal 20-day journey. And in the archaeological sites being excavated right now, new evidence of these practices continues to surface. What the Aztecs created with their festival of the flayed god was perhaps the most extreme form of religious devotion ever practiced by a major civilization. For 20 days each year, they made death visible, tangible, wearable. They transformed the ultimate human fear into a sacred garment. And whether we find it horrifying or fascinating or both, we can't deny its power. The truth about Tlacaxipehualiztli reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary things in service of their beliefs. The priests who wore those rotting skins believed they were saving the world. In their minds, every day of suffering, every breath of putrid air, every horrified reaction from the citizens was necessary to ensure the sun would rise and the corn would grow. That's the real horror and the real wonder of this story. Not that they wore human skins, but that they believed so deeply in the necessity of wearing them that they would endure 20 days of living nightmare. It makes you wonder what beliefs we hold today that future generations will find equally incomprehensible.